taking your time. So I'm going to introduce them. Gabe is an associate law professor at UNM Law School. His scholarship and policy work focus on the equity issues within climate change and energy development and distribution. As a law professor, he also co-supervises UNM Natural Resources and Environmental Law Clinic, which provides law and policy representation to low-income and underserved communities. On a somewhat personal note, this amazing and needed law clinic is providing representation to the Valencia Water Watchers in Valencia County, which I happen to be a part of, and so that we can be prepared for any application which may come forth to drill for oil and gas in our county. So I have much gratitude to Gabe and the students working in the law clinic. Gabe and the clinic helped with the CEED grant, the Low Income Energy Efficiency Grant, Block Grant Act, and he was a co-author of New Mexico's Grid Modernization Baseline Report. His recent scholarship has focused on ensuring that energy is affordable to everyone in the clean energy transition. And there are many more things that Gabe's done, but I just highlighted a few things. So thank you, Gabe, for being with us and giving us this report on this critical report on large polluting plants in New Mexico. And also with us is Elena Kreiger, who received her PhD from the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton, where her research focused on optimizing energy storage in renewable energy systems. She is the Director of Research at PSE Healthy Energy. Her research focuses on accelerating the transition to clean and renewable energy sources. Her recent work includes analyzing integration of energy storage and other distributed energy resources to reduce greenhouse gas and criteria pollutant emissions, and thereby increase resilience and clean energy access for underserved communities. She has characterized operational, emissions, health, air quality, and environmental justice measures for power plants across the country, including analysis on opportunities to replace peaker power plants with energy storage. So this is a person we want to learn from, get to know, and call on to help with New Mexico's transition to increased renewable energy production. So thank you, Elena, also for taking the time to be with us and discuss this important report. And each of you feel free to highlight any other points out of your extensive backgrounds and research. So please get started. Gabe, thank you.
Before you go out, Gabe, if I could just say, as we go on, if people would like to put their questions in the chat function, that both helps us remember what the questions were, and then we'll go to those when we get to the Q&A session at the end. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Anne and Tom and Steffi and Jim, for inviting us today. We're really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing on this report with you all and with everybody here on this webinar. I'm just going to give a few words of introduction about kind of how this report came about, and then I'll pass it over to Elena to provide an overview of the report findings, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the policy implications from the findings in our report. So this is a collaboration between UNM and in particular our U Just Transition Grand Challenge. One of our co-authors, Shannon Sanchez-Youngman, is from the College of Population Health, and she works with me on this Grand Challenge at UNM, where we're seeking to put together an interdisciplinary team to support work on an equitable transition to a clean and climate resilient economy. And we're super excited to be able to partner and co-author with real experts at PSE Healthy Energy, including Elena and her colleague Angelica Ruiz, who worked on this report. I will say that this report is somewhat of a complement to earlier work that PSE Healthy Energy did and that Elena led. They have a report called Equity Focused Climate Strategies for New Mexico. This report is kind of laser-like focused on large stationary sources, as Tom said, those biggest climate polluters. This prior report that came out a couple of years ago goes into a lot of other sources that we don't capture here, so I highly recommend that to you as well. And in the conversation, it might come up in some of the questions, so I put the link in there. So we're also excited. Center for Civic Policy acted as a fiscal agent and advisor. I just want to give them a shout out, and Michael Leon Guerrero and other folks who helped us think through some of the framing and contextual issues for this report from a community perspective. And our funder for this report was the Environmental Defense Fund. The reason that we took on this subject matter was because we saw a real gap in policies here in New Mexico to address this very significant source of climate pollution. There are different ways to slice sources. So we're only focusing on very large stationary sources. So not all of the oil and gas sector, we're not looking at the transportation sector, but we don't have a policy in New Mexico that addresses pollution from these very large sources. Some other states do, which is part of the reason that we want to take a look at how much climate pollution was coming from these sources. But not only climate pollution, we also wanted to take a look at the other types of health damaging air pollution, nitrous oxides, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, the things that harm people who are living very close or in the same region or in the same airshed as these sources on an immediate basis. We wanted to take a look at who lives nearby and who might be harmed by that, which are all questions that I think are important in designing not only an effective climate policy, but one that equitably reduces conventional or health damaging air pollutants. So with that, let me pass it over to Elena. And Elena, if you want, I'm happy to just advance the slides as you call it, or I can hand over the screen to you.
Thanks, Gabe. I will probably have you just advance the slides. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having us. So we took a look at large stationary sources of pollution across New Mexico. These are typically facilities that have what are called EPA Title V permits. And we found 189 stationary sources. These are things like gas processing plants, refineries, power plants, compressor stations, mines, manufacturing. They do not include small oil and gas facilities, oil and gas wells, and things like that. These are just the larger facilities. And forward. And unfortunately, the data, when we looked at that, and I'm trying to see if they've even updated it now. As of a couple of months ago, they hadn't. The most complete data we had on these facilities was only through 2019. So we could do our best estimate. Some of them are more recent, but sort of comprehensively. Based on emissions from 2019, we think that they are responsible for about a quarter of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a large chunk. Next slide, please. And of course, in addition to greenhouse gas emissions, these facilities are burning coal, they're burning gas, and they're emitting a huge number of health damaging air pollutants. These are things like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide. We suspect that they're responsible for the majority of the state's sulfur dioxide emissions, and a large share of their nitrogen dioxide emissions. These not only have direct health impacts, but react in the atmosphere to form ozone and particulate matter. And these, of course, can cause heart attacks. These can cause respiratory health problems, asthma attacks, both near to the facilities and downwind. Sometimes the impacts can stretch for hundreds of miles from the source of pollution. They tend to be highest per capita next to the facility, but again, in aggregate, the pollution can go a really long ways. They're also releasing particulate matter and then hazardous air pollutants. These are things like benzene. Next slide, please. So to meet the state climate targets, This is a huge chunk of emissions, 25%. And so that means that we're going to have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from these facilities. There's an opportunity to get public health benefits too. We reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we stop operating a refinery or something like that, and the co-pollutant emissions will come down as well. But there also may be strategies for us to prioritize certain facilities. So maybe if we retire the highest polluting facilities first, for example, we may be able to get greater health benefits earlier. Next slide. So this is a mix of the greenhouse gases from the 189 facilities that we found across the state. And apologies if you can hear my dog snorting in the background, but that's what you get. Anyway, so we found that the majority of facilities were in the oil and gas sector. That's 120 of them. But the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions came from power plants. And so if you're going to tackle individual large facilities, looking at the power sector might be the way to go. And then oil and gas facilities are smaller, they're more distributed around. There's additional contributions from things like mining, manufacturing, and landfills. Next slide. So the total health damaging air pollutants, however, are largest in aggregate from the oil and gas sector. So if we switch back real fast again, we saw that the total number of greenhouse gas emissions were highest from power plants. Forward again, we can see that red section there, that's oil and gas. So the highest number of, emissions from nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and so forth are from the oil and gas sector. Next slide. I think there's some text on this. This has improved recently and actually wasn't true as of 2019. What we did is we removed a couple of plants that had retired recently. So the San Juan coal plant, the Pruitt Escalante coal plant, and the Eunice gas processing plant were three really large facilities that had a disproportionate share of health damaging air pollutants. The shift of emission, the mix of emissions has shifted towards oil and gas once we've taken those coal plants offline. There's great progress, but there's a long way to go. Next slide. We also wanted to take a look at how large the facilities were and how many greenhouse gas emissions were coming from them compared to other kinds of facilities, to think about what kinds of greenhouse gas emission caps would actually capture some of these facilities. Some are pretty small, some are giant. In a lot of other states, large facility emissions of greenhouse gases are capped at 25,000 million metric tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent per year. But we took a look at the facilities with between 10,000 and 25,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year as well. And what we found is that a disproportionate share of health damaging air pollutant emissions came from those facilities. So on the left side here, you can see that big light turquoise color. Those are the greenhouse gas emissions from the big facilities, over 25,000 million metric tons per year. And then that next small sort of medium turquoise color, that's the emissions from these sort of medium-sized 10 to 25,000 ton facilities. If you look at nitrogen dioxide emissions, though, you can see that the share emissions from those sort of moderately sized facilities is significantly larger than the share of greenhouse gas emissions. So there may be a benefit to designing some kind of regulations that capture these somewhat smaller facilities than regulations that are covered in other states. Or you may be some kind of complementary set of policies above and beyond something that is set at a 25,000 million metric ton threshold. Next slide. We also wanted to take a look at where these facilities were located and who was living nearby. As I mentioned before, the health impacts of some of these can stretch for hundreds of miles across state lines. But the highest impacts per capita are going to be on populations that are nearby and downwind. And so you may have disproportionate impacts in nearby communities. One of the first components we looked at were facilities located on tribal lands, and we found 4. Of course, the giant Four Corners generating station, as well as various gas facilities. I'll highlight the Four Corners generating station in particular as being both like one of the largest, if not, I think the largest at this point, source of many kinds of health damaging air pollutants left in the state, but also under separate jurisdiction from much of the state because it is on Navajo land. And so there's somewhat complicated ways to try to incorporate this into greenhouse gas planning. Next slide. We also found that many of the facilities are located in communities of color. On an upside, a lot of the facilities were located in rural areas without anybody living directly nearby. We did not find that the facilities were disproportionately located in communities of color across the state. But it's worth noting that since the majority of the state could be considered non-white in some classifications, that does not mean that it means most of the facilities were located near communities of color, just not necessarily disproportionately so. And so there may be strategies where you could think about who is living nearby in order to prioritize, let's say, the retirement of facilities near these communities. Even if communities of color are not disproportionately exposed, many of them, as well as low-income communities, may be more vulnerable to the pollution from these facilities. And so there may be a benefit of trying to shift away from emissions that expose these communities to air pollutants. Next slide. This is a figure of large stationary source emitters and low-income populations. And we did find that the facilities in urban areas, not necessarily in rural areas, as again, in rural areas, there's a bunch of facilities without too many people living nearby. It's hard to sort of figure out statistics. But in urban areas, we found that the facilities were disproportionately located next to low-income populations. Next slide. We also took a quick look at where there were large stationary sources near places with high asthma rates. This might be an additional factor to consider, which is that populations with underlying health concerns like asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or other kinds of underlying health impacts might be more vulnerable to the ongoing pollution from these facilities. And so there may be an additional benefit to target moving away from pollution in areas where people have a lot of underlying conditions. Next slide. We found that the facilities tended to be located in sort of, I think we ended up with 4 regional clusters. The first one, not too surprisingly, is the San Juan Basin. These are disproportionately oil and gas facilities. 56 out of 65 of them are in the oil and gas center. Four Corners is the largest source of pollution. This area has seen a benefit from the retirement of San Juan, as well as Escalante coal plants. But there are additional sources of pollution, and some of it depends on pollutant type. The Gallup refinery in McKinley, for example, is a large source of hazardous air pollutants and particulate matter, as are the gas compressor stations sort of throughout the area. A lot of the facilities are in rural areas, but some are in Farmington and Bloomington. And another thing to note is that we only looked at those large facilities. So a lot of these are compounding pollution on top of all of the wells and all of the production that is happening across this area as well. And so within that context, we suspect that there's going to be sort of compounding pollution in this area. Another thing to note is this is 2019 data, and oil and gas production has been growing a lot across the state. And while we don't have all of the emissions data, we suspect that some of the emissions associated with all of the associated facilities, whether that's gas processing or gas compressor stations, may be going up as well. Next slide. The other cluster, of course, is in the Permian. 52 out of 67 of the facilities are in the oil and gas sector. Sort of same kind of idea. Additional sources of health damaging air pollutants are also from the gas processing plants, a couple of the gas power plants, as well as the Artesia refinery. And there's a mix of facilities in both rural as well as urban areas across this region. Next slide. Albuquerque had a smaller total number of facilities, but it was also a cluster. We found 14. There's a broader mix of facilities, things like a cement plant, a couple of gas plants, gypsum manufacturing, landfills. And we found that in this area, the facilities were located in more densely populated areas with more low-income populations living nearby. And so this raises some, again, sort of broader environmental justice concerns that maybe could be addressed as we start thinking about transitioning away from these facilities. Another thing from a policy standpoint is that Albuquerque and the whole county tend to have their own air district. And so some of the reporting, as well as the jurisdiction, is separate from the rest of the state. Next slide. Finally, Las Cruces, 9 facilities, a couple of power plants, a couple of landfills tended to dominate the emissions here. And in particular, there was a power plant and a landfill located in low-income communities of color in the Sunland Park area. And these facilities jumped out as a couple that may be worth paying attention to. Next slide. We wanted to take a look at who actually owns these facilities. There are a couple on here again that have thankfully retired, including San Juan and Escalante coal plants. One of the things that's a little complicated is some of them have a whole bunch of different owners. And so if you're sort of trying to figure out who's responsible or who's in charge of decision-making, there are a few different powers that be to think about in terms of trying to, mitigate emissions, or in terms of who's in charge of decision-making around these facilities. Next slide. And then back, I think that's it for the findings. So back over to Gabe for policy discussion.
Thanks, Elena. So we tried to identify some policy implications from these findings. And in our report, some of these are kind of come from a summary of the existing laws that we have to regulate greenhouse gas pollution in New Mexico. But the first finding is that there are, as Elena said, real opportunities to not only to reduce health damaging air pollutants, to address environmental justice concerns by regulating large pollution sources, but those come with some caveats. So the first caveat is that there is that opportunity if the reductions in greenhouse gases come from in-state facilities. So there's a variety of types of ways that you can achieve, that states have put in place programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Some of those programs include policy elements such as trading with other states or trading with sources in other states, offsets that allow you to claim emission reductions through other projects like like growing forests or carbon capture and sequestration. As we explain in the report, all of those strategies, if they are not constrained, could limit the benefits, the public health benefits that you could get from a greenhouse gas policy in terms of the co-pollutant reductions. We do note that if some of these policy mechanisms are allowed, if they were limited or combined with co-pollution reduction requirements, meaning if you said, you actually have to either, like Elena said, you can target emission reductions, or you can only use these components in certain situations, or you could say you have to both achieve greenhouse gas reductions and achieve reductions of these other pollutants. Those are all ways that you could try to maximize the public health benefits from your climate policy. Picking up where Elena left off on the thresholds, one of our findings is that if you're designing a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for large stationary sources, large facilities, you'll probably get more public health benefits if you set the threshold at 10,000 tons, million metric tons per year, as opposed to 25,000. And the reason for that is that, as Elena said, there's a disproportionate share of health damaging air pollutants, the nitrogen dioxide emissions, the hazardous air pollution emissions come from those smaller sources, so we can get more public health benefits if we can get greenhouse gas reductions from those smaller sources, even though they don't provide a whole lot of the greenhouse gas, a super large percentage of the greenhouse gas emissions. Next, we want to talk about a story of two different sectors here, the power sector and the oil and gas sector. On the electricity side, as you all know, the Energy Transition Act sets a 100% zero carbon electricity mandate, which is driving reductions and has driven reductions, together with enforcement actions from coal-fired power plants, and is transitioning away, will drive a transition away from fossil fuel. That is making a difference. We've seen how significant the closures of San Juan and Escalante were, both on the greenhouse gas emission side and also on the health damaging air pollution side. Really substantial public health benefits, and we expect those to keep going because the mandate continues to require increased amounts of clean energy displacing fossil fuels over time. Now, that does mean that there are maybe some shifts in generation, and in our report, we identify one of the power plants in Belen, for example, which is a natural gas power plant that has increased emissions after the San Juan generating station went offline. So there's a chance that there may be increases in health damaging air pollution during this transition at certain power plants, and that is worth keeping an eye on. We also note that reopening San Juan, as has been the proposal by certain parties, could significantly increase health damaging air pollution if there are no new air pollution controls that are put on that facility. So one thing to keep in mind. In contrast with the electricity sector, the oil and gas sector does not have a policy in place that requires continuing emission reductions. We should note that there was a lot of work by advocates in the state to get both two different regulations in place that will reduce methane emissions from all oil and gas sources, both the large sources that we're talking about and the thousands of wells throughout the state that also contribute a significant amount of pollution. But those, we don't know how large the reductions will be from those sources. I saw a question about enforcement. That's certainly one question, but also the way that these regulations work is that they generally require better technologies at every step of the supply chain. That's going to have tremendous benefits. Those are really important regulations. They're really going to reduce emissions, but they're not going to require continuing reductions from the oil and gas sector over time in the same way that our economy-wide climate targets do that Governor Lujan Grisham put in place in the executive order. And so we don't have a policy in place that will similarly continue to drive reductions from the oil and gas sector down. So there's a gap there. The other thing that we note is that you can think that there are many different types of policies you could consider. You could consider policies that require greenhouse gas reductions from all of these large stationary sources, or you could set specific requirements for specific sectors. And because the oil and gas sector emits so many health damaging air pollutants, if you set limits just for those sectors, maybe by basin, for example, you could expect some significant public health benefits from those climate policies. Another way that you could try to get at that same kind of equity thing, same kind of equitable reductions of health damaging air pollutants, is perhaps considering setting requirements to reduce emissions by regional cluster. So we identified those 4 regional clusters. You could consider a policy that seeks to cap and require consistent reductions, continuing reductions from those regional sectors. One thing that we noted is that there have been some outliers, some large sources that disproportionately emit greenhouse gases and other pollutants, and that may be located in communities of color or low-income communities. We note in the report that San Juan Generating Station and Eunice Gas Plant were both closed in part because of enforcement actions brought by advocates in some cases, the state in other cases, and those enforcement actions were significant and effective in getting closures of those plants, resulting in large public health benefits. So this could be a useful complementary policy, is to invest more resources in that kind of enforcement, and particularly to look at some of these high emitting facilities potentially located in communities of color or low-income communities to see if there are air permit violations in those facilities. And we're not saying, we didn't do an analysis of air permit violations, but we are noting that a couple of plants, the Chaco Gas Plant, the Rio Grande Generating Station, are high emitting facilities in communities of color and perhaps worth monitoring. And I'll close here with 2 points, one which isn't on the slide, but one is that large stationary sources are certainly not the whole problem. So as Elena said, they are a very significant part of our emissions, about 25%, but we are missing 3 categories, big categories of sources here. We're missing the small dispersed oil and gas sources, all of those thousands of wells, which we know emit collectively a substantial part of emissions in this state. Oil and gas together is about 50% of emissions in this state. So we're missing a big part of the oil and gas picture for those small dispersed oil and gas sources. Another part is transportation, which is the largest sector of emissions after the state. Obviously very different in terms of how you analyze it, although Elena's previous report, which is, there's a link in the chat, did take a look at that. And then buildings is another major sector. So just emphasizing that we hope our report helps inform discussions about how to address both the climate and health damaging air pollution side from these sources, but we're acknowledging that this is not the whole picture whatsoever. And then finally, one thing that we didn't put in here, but is in the report, is that Elena and her team identified some really significant data gaps. And I don't know, Elena, do you want to talk about that for a second?
I mean, I think one of the data gaps is that we couldn't get reporting for certain facilities. There's different jurisdictions in terms of who is reporting what in Albuquerque or on tribal lands in certain cases. Some facilities only reported some pollutants versus others. But I think part of the problem is just the fact that we don't have data for the last couple of years. And so, again, at least at the time that we were doing this up through the beginning of this year, NMED only had released data through 2019. What I just put into the chat is oil and gas production for New Mexico. Each of those links shows just how much oil and gas production has increased in the state in the last 3 years. It's just shooting up, which means that probably all of the associated emissions from oil and gas facilities, we suspect, even if the rate of emissions are going down based on new regulations, there might be emissions that are going up, and we just don't have a great sense of what that is because the reporting is lagging by a few years. And so having more up-to-date reporting in particular would help us have a sense of, one, whether these emissions are continuing to rise, and whether or not things like the methane regulations are having an impact on the both on greenhouse gas emissions and on co-pollutant emissions as well.
Thanks, Elena. And with that, that concludes our presentation, but happy to answer questions and have a discussion.
Thank you, Gabe and Elena. Sorry, my video's jumping all over. Why don't we go ahead and have people who've asked questions unmute themselves. Meta, you had a couple of questions. You want to direct those to Gabe and Elena?
Sure. So I'm always looking for the action to take. And so I wondered what their assessment of the best next step. I thought the last session of the legislature, I was surprised naively, obviously, that they didn't what I understand, put enforcement on some of the methane emissions. And I wondered what you thought about that. And then another really naive question, but I've always wanted to ask it. When you say you're looking for, you need more data. I mean, I have asthma myself, so I read the data every day of how the air is. And so I know it's naive, but aren't there other ways to get metrics that show the air quality rather than waiting for their data? Those are my questions.
Elena, do you want to start with the data question?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think you can get some, and we've done some proxies like, well, we get power plant data more recently. We don't have the oil and gas production data. And so we can sort of make a guess of what's happening in terms of emissions. We can look at air quality data. One of the problems is that the EPA air monitors tend to be pretty widely spaced. And you can get much more higher variations air pollutant exposures than are captured in those data, in those air monitors. And so sometimes in some areas there's low cost air quality monitors, but there can be huge spatial gaps, particularly in terms of identifying hotspots. And those also require some modeling in order to connect both emissions with the air quality concentrations. So yeah, we can definitely do some proxies, but it's harder to sort of pin down individual facilities and how things are changing across in a comprehensive kind of way.
And I can punt on one of the questions and address another question. So in terms of what is the best policy going forward, that wasn't really the focus of our report. There are a lot of, you can see states that have been adopting a variety of policies. There are sectoral strategies like zero carbon emission standards for the electricity sector. We've seen some oil and gas policies, specific policies here in New Mexico, but again, they don't give us those continuous emission reductions. We see a number of states that have put in place economy-wide policies, some kind of cap, and those are, so there's a bunch of policies out there. But we haven't, the purpose of our report isn't really to say one specific policy is the way to go. I don't know if Elena, you want to chime in on that or not. So I know you all on the ground are doing lots of great advocacy work around that. And I'm always happy to talk with what I know by examining other states. On the enforcement side, though, I can say, we've seen lots and lots of reports that state agencies just don't have enough resources to conduct continuous, effective enforcement. I see a question from Tom Singer about, are there existing untapped litigation opportunities to reduce pollution from these facilities, and mentioning the work that Wild Earth Guardians has done. We highlighted some of their recent enforcement actions. So under the Clean Air Act, anybody can take a party to court after they give them notice if they've exceeded their air quality permits. And certainly that is a way and a legal strategy to try to get enforcement. And in fact, Wild Earth Guardians was successful in getting a settlement with an oil and gas producer to have increased controls put on place. A couple of years back, the state environment department was able to get a settlement that included with shutdowns of some facilities. So just based on those examples alone, it certainly seems to me like that kind of third-party enforcement under the Clean Air Act is a viable strategy. But again, not as a replacement to a regulatory policy, but as a complement to regulatory policies.
Well, that's helpful. Tom, do you have another question besides that?
Well, it's just, I was struck by the early slide that showed that the power plants were a significantly larger source of greenhouse gas emissions overall than oil and gas. And I just wanted to confirm that the study used the 20-year global warming forcing, for that. And I'm wondering where the methane data came from, because if you consider underreporting and an 86 times greater than carbon, I'm surprised that that's the result, but I'll accept it if that's the result.
So I put an answer about this in the chat, which is no, we did not use the 20-year. And part of the reason for that was that some of the databases that are reporting are giving us the CO2 equivalent data, and we don't have the specific emissions data for different greenhouse gas is under those sort of aggregate data. So that's another data gap, is that we don't have it broken out. So we couldn't necessarily calculate it independently from each of the sources that we were looking at. You know, some of that for power plants, it depends also on how you think about life cycle emissions or not. So for a gas power plant, would you also take into account the upstream life cycle emissions associated with gas combustion, or just the point source, because you don't want to double count with the life cycle emissions of gas that are already captured in the state. Some of that can get complicated. Anyway, it'll become, how should I put this, less interesting as more of the coal plants retire and you increasingly have oil and gas and associated life cycle emissions for those.
We're all for keeping the target on their backs.
Great. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so I suspect that the oil and gas emissions are an undercount. And as I said, I think it's also an undercount for oil and gas, in part because production has just gone up so much. And so I have to assume that even though we don't have the data, that processing and everything else has probably gone up significantly too.
Jim, hi, you've had your hand up. And
yes, thank you, Ann. Thank you, Ann. I want to thank Elena and Gabe. This is really an interesting discussion and an interesting report. And I also wanted to talk a little bit, a question about data, but I'm worried that too much discussion about data is going to distract from kind of the big picture conclusions of the report. So I guess that's my question. Tom Singer and Natabo's question, that we know from experience that data specifically in the oil and gas sector, a lot of it is self-reported, and we know the problems with that type of data. But just in a larger point of view, do you think, either of you could respond to this, do you think that the problems with the data, which are, generally quantitative, would they raise to the level of change if you had better data, the qualitative conclusions of your report? Or do you think that you have enough information to sustain, even if I went after some of the data quality, that wouldn't be a fatal flaw to the study?
So, I mean, I think it certainly introduces uncertainties, but I also think that we are not recommending specific policy, we're not saying this is specific policy. We're sort of trying to outline what the policy trade-offs might be, given those uncertainties, right? And so I think the general gist is correct. These large stationary sources are a large source of greenhouse gas emissions, and they have a large number of co-pollutants, and thinking about the co-pollutants in the process sort of upfront with the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from these facilities has the potential to achieve greater health benefits than a greenhouse, and people also might do so, and that these facilities are not necessarily captured under existing policies and regulations in the state. And so the fact that we think that there's a gap and that there's potential to look at the sort of health and equity benefits of additional policies, and these are some of the things to take into account while developing those policies, I think all of those hold. Even if, again, the specifics are going to change, particularly over the last few years. And if there's, if we take into account the 20-year global warming potential for methane or other things like that.
Thank you very
I'll
much.
just add to that really quickly that the reason I asked Elena to talk about data at the end is because it's framed as one of our recommendations. And I think that is, so it's not, I don't think that the idea was that this is a caveat that, we're not confident in our results. It's that especially to try to capture some of these public health benefits, one of the challenges was that Elena and her team were mixing and matching different data sources to try to get the greenhouse gas emissions and the nitrous dioxide emissions and the particulate matter emissions and the hazardous air pollutant emissions. If we want to get the best public health benefit, if we want to make these policies as equitable as possible for reducing not just greenhouse gas emissions, but reducing health damaging air pollutants in communities that are disproportionately burdened by them, then it will help us to have better data moving forward. And so I think, to me, that's why it's an important component of the puzzle. It's not as a limitation, but as a way to have smarter, better policies that can get both the climate benefits and health pollution, health and equity benefits moving forward.
Thank you.
Elaine, Chimino, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think I had two of them. One was, why do you think that the data stopped in 2019? Was it because of COVID at that point? Or is it that they just haven't updated the 5-year? Usually they update every 5 years, or I've been told. And because I'm looking at a lot of data myself, and I'm finding the same gaps that you have mentioned. And so that's one of the questions. And the other, I just want to make sure I understand if you would elaborate a little bit more on supporting carbon capture as part of a solution. I just want to understand what you meant by that. Thank you very much.
Gabe, you start.
Okay, and I can talk about the carbon capture point. So my point there was that many policies that states are implementing to reduce greenhouse gases allow carbon capture as a mechanism for compliance with that policy. So for example, even in our state, with regards to the zero carbon electricity mandate, up to 80%, the electricity has to be renewable energy. But between 80 and 100, the statute isn't clear, and it's quite possible, if I remember correctly, that the statute isn't clear, that utilities could use carbon capture and sequestration to count as zero carbon emission sources for that 80 to 100% part of the standard. In other state policies, you can see, for example, in cap and trade policies or in clean fuel standard policies, or sometimes even in standards, emission standards for individual power plants, that carbon capture and sequestration is one way that a utility could comply with that regulatory policy. So it's not that I was saying that I was supporting that. My point was that if you allow carbon capture and sequestration, the data shows that it reduces, depending on the type that's used, it can reduce some of the conventional health damaging air pollutant emissions, but not all of them. In other cases, it can actually increase, like with nitrogen dioxide. I know Elena knows a lot about this science as well. So the point being, if you allow it without limitations, you won't have the opportunity to get the same degree of health benefits as you would if you just required greenhouse gas emissions at the source